Welcome to today's video. You are going to see me take this teeny tiny bathroom, which is a little small and it doesn't have much light, and add in a nice 2 foot by 4 foot window. Come along. Now, first thing I want to do is to make sure that this is going to be even. All right, so when I say even, what I mean is the entrance doorway is about 2 feet, that side trim piece is about 2 feet off the corner, and the inside edge of the door frame is about 28 inches. So the inside edge of that window, I want to be 28 inches. So it'll create the illusion that when you walk into the room, you're centered directly on the window. So it's not askew, but it's just directly in front of you. I think that'll really help just draw the eye line into the room. And it will, of course, bring in a lot of light, but I really want to make sure that it is centered based off of that doorway. Now, to do all this, I did take a level and just traced out my outline for my 2040 window, which is a nerdy way of saying it's 2 feet wide and 4 foot, or it's 2 feet wide, yes, and 4 feet tall. Now, I will point out to you here, my house is a brick home, so I first use a massive 1/8 inch drill bit and drilled holes just in the location of where the window is going to be. That helps me to kind of have a rough parameter of where I'm going to need to cut out with my actually masonry saw a little bit later on in the video. Now, to get all this done, I did have to remove the drywall just using a multi-tool and then remove the insulation. I would advise that you wear a mask whenever you touch insulation. I ended up regretting it after I did this because, yeah, I covered up appropriately. I didn't have to worry about getting any little fiberglass bits in my arms. But once I pulled out the insulation, I then realized I was breathing some of it in and it caused me to cough a little extra, which wasn't super fun. Now, to frame out the window, I did have to remove the exterior wall studs, just these two right here. Now, don't worry, the wall didn't fall down on me, which you'll see, but there is just a stepwise process I had to take to remove all of these as well. Now, what you're going to see me doing is I'm actually cutting this T-ply. The T-ply is that white border barrier that's between the drywall studs. That's actually the exterior insulation, or not insulation, it's a weather-resistant siding that's on the outside of the house. Now, I do have to cut that because there are these braces for the brick that the brick will secure onto. All right, now let's talk about framing out the window. So I'm just going to draw here. Forgive me, I'm not an artist, but I'm going to draw exactly what I'm going to do. So the top plate and the bottom plate are just the very topmost member and the very bottommost member of the framing structure, right? So the top 2x4 is the top plate, the bottom 2x4 is the bottom plate. Now, when you're framing out a window here, you are transferring load from the top of the structure to the bottom of the structure, or from the roof line to the floor. That's called a king stud. So that king stud is going to run me just a little bit over, or rather a little bit under 8 feet tall, because this room is 8 feet tall. So that king stud is the outside stud. Now, the inside stud is called a jack stud. The jack stud is going to run from the floor to a header that supports the weight of, or distributes the weight of the home around the window frame for the house. So you'll see me draw out the rest of this. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a framer. I am just a builder. I know how to do these. I'm not super proficient, but you're going to watch me be able to work my way through this and hopefully come up with something that's looks pretty great. Now, on either side of the window, you're going to have a jack stud on the inside of the header and a king stud on the inside of the header. Then between the top plate and the header are these three little cripple braces. So you're, again, everything in framing is just about transferring the load from the top plate to the bottom plate. Then the bottom of the windowsill is just that sill, right? And underneath you're going to have additional small cripples. Now, as we do transfer the weight, we still want to make sure that the opening is going to be the correct size. So with that interior opening, I do need to make large enough for my 2 foot wide and 4 foot tall window. So let's get to it. I went ahead and I used my miter saw to cut out a few 2x4s to frame in that king stud, and then come back in and frame out the jack stud on either side. I would highly advise that whenever you do this, it's actually a little bit easier just to pre-nail everything like I did on that second piece, to nail those two studs together. And then, of course, just using some toenails, I secured the stud to the top and the bottom plate. And then, again, just went in and nailed in that header. The 2x6 header is actually just 2x6, or two 2x6s just sandwiched together. And then in the middle is a little bit of R foam. It's just a sheet of insulation foam. You can use plywood. I just happen to have a little bit of extra from a job site. Now, as I was going about nailing in these bottom cripples, I was just getting super excited. So you will see me here in a moment install some of the top cripples. Now, I did not install them correctly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. I actually had to come back and cut this out and then reinstall them correctly. Again, not to beat a dead horse, but everything in framing is about transitioning that top load from the top plate to the bottom plate so that anything will just transfer directly into the foundation. From there, I took my masonry bit and using a hammer drill, drilled a few pilot holes through the exterior sheathing, that T-ply, and through the brick. It actually gave me a few of these holes where you can see the daylight outside. Now I use these holes as a reference point to line up my 8-foot level, and then I just used, I believe it's one of those Milwaukee exterior markers, and I marked that line all the way down on my brick. Now the line on the left is actually not a line, that is an expansion joint. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but using that line as a reference point that I drew, I went ahead and I used a 9-inch blade concrete saw to cut out a big line just right down the brick so that I could install my window. Now, again, this other line we're talking about, so this is actually called a expansion joint. So the expansion joint does what it sounds like. It allows the brick to move as the house expands and contracts. It gets hot, it gets cold, it gets wet, it gets dry. The house and the soil expand and contract a little bit here and there. And that little expansion joint just allows the brick to move enough so that the house doesn't have these massive cracks of brick going up and down it. Now, once I removed all the brick, I went about being a total freak and vacuuming the grass. Okay, yeah, don't judge me. I felt really weird doing this anyway, and even weirder recording myself doing it, but that was the only way I could think of to get this all out of the grass. After getting all that cleaned up, I put another piece of T-ply over the existing T-ply because I'd made several cuts in it, and then just nailed it back into place. To cut out the window itself, I went over the top and used a router to cut out the window because I thought it would look super cool. Honestly, it just created a huge mess. Just use a safety razor, cut out that window opening, and it will be a lot better. Now, I left this in here because look at that face. Oh my gosh. Okay, my 2-year-old was super pumped about getting a window in, and it made me feel great as a dad that she was getting excited about what I was doing. I think it helps to make it all worth it. One of the most important things that you need to do whenever you install a window is to make sure that it does not leak and it is waterproof. And the way that you do that is you flash it. Okay, weirdo. Keep your clothes on, get your mind out of the gutter. Flashing just means that you're using a weatherproof tape to seal the seams of the existing pieces. Do it top to bottom. And then to seal the window into place, use something like this OSI Max clear caulking. Do not caulk the bottom of the window. If you do, it will let water get back into the structure. Only caulk the top and the sides of the window. You're actually seeing the inside of the window on this side because when I flip it around with that red sticker facing outward, you'll be able to see that that caulking actually smushes directly up against the T-ply and the window itself to form a seal. Now, I thought about not putting this in here because I want to look like I know what I'm doing, and frankly, I kind of know what I'm doing. It's more of a trial and error situation, if I'm honest. When I put the window in, a rookie mistake I made was I didn't double check my measurements, so I had to go back, knock a little bit here with a hammer, cut out a little bit there with a skill saw, and make sure that everything was in its place before appropriately bracing it. Now, when you install windows and you use those screws, just use stainless steel screws, about 2 1/4, 2 3/4 inch pan head screws. Start with one corner, make sure everything is plumb and flush, and then work your way around as you install screws. A window like this is pretty small, so you probably need 2 to 3 screws on the top, 2 to 3 screws on the bottom, and 3 screws on each side to hold it all in place. Again, it's fairly simple overall, but a very satisfying part of this window install was using the fire blocking foam in between the window and the frame of the window, or actually the studs that framed out the window, to seal everything because you do want to make sure that everything is sealed up in case of a fire. It's just a building code regulation. After that, I took the existing insulation I had, cut it down to the correct size, and I remembered to put on a mask this time so I wasn't inhaling insulation and coughing for hours afterward. Now, to install the drywall, or to reinstall the drywall, what I would suggest that you do, and what I did in this instance, is just take 2 regular utility studs, just like this, cut them down to be, 2 inches or 1.5 inches square, and then you can use those little strips and just using 3-inch screws, mount them to the existing studs that are there in the wall, and then you can use those studs that are already in place that you framed out, along with the little stud strips that you cut, as a reference point to secure all the drywall on and make that install just a little bit easier, I went ahead and cut out roughly the opening for the window using a multi-tool, and then the next morning went about picking brick. The brick color for my home is called Grayson. Now, my house is a builder grade home. It's about 2 years old, but whether my house was 2 years old or 20 years old, you're going to run into the exact same problem, which is no matter what you do, the brick color will not match exactly, because the brick, although it's technically the same color, wasn't produced on the exact same day in the exact same batch as the brick that's currently on my home. So a way to remedy that is exactly what I'm doing here. I ordered a bunch of extra brick and pulled out the bricks that matched closest to my home, which left me with that right side palette full of brick, the darker color here, which you can see kind of corresponds to the current house color that I have right now. Later that day, I went back to start filling all those screw holes and doing the tape and bed for the drywall that I just hung. I've never done drywall work before. I've been in construction for multiple years and I always use somebody else. I've heard it said before, drywall is like an art. That could not be truer, because as I went about doing all of this setup here, my ambitions were to bring the whole drywall in the room to a level 5, which means it's a perfectly flat finish. I have a level 3 finish. You can see that texture on the wall there on the right side. But in pretty short order, I realized, okay, I'm going to need to let the professionals do this, so you're going to see how that finished out. And then, of course, how we trimmed out the window in a moment. But most importantly, the pretty stuff is cool, but I do want to make sure that the window actually operates and functions, and I keep the structural integrity of the wall above the window. So I added the extra 2 cripples on either side of the window so that that weight would appropriately transition from the stud, from the very top of the header, all the way down that jack stud to the floor. Now, you heard me talking about that drywall repair. I did call on a favor, and I did not do this myself, but had one of my buddies come texture out this wall and just make everything match that additional level 3 drywall that I have through the rest of the home. I did forget to tell him to not put in these drywall returns around the inside of the window, because I was going to put on some window trim, which you're going to see here in a minute. If you haven't already, go back and watch my last video where I showed you how I install all this trim work in our guest bathroom. It was great, it looked awesome, and I went step by step giving you a great in-depth overview of everything. But I will just kind of keep it high level here, because a lot more of those details matter a little bit later on as we do this window casing. So we'll start adding some of those details in now. So what I did to install the window casing, first and foremost, by removing the drywall returns, I'm going to create an internal window sill that goes all the way around the inside of it. That sill portion at the bottom that I'm measuring is going to be a 2x6, whereas the left, right, and the top pieces are going to be this select 1x4 pine. So I went ahead and I marked my vertical pieces, cutting them down to size, and I would suggest that you use some type of fine tooth, fine finish saw blade like I'm using here on my miter saw. Then I cut that bottom 1x6 windowsill piece, and finally that top piece of the casing I cut down too. Next, I went about ripping down those 1x4 pieces, which are actually 3.5 inches wide. I ripped them down to be 3 1/4 inch wide, because the inside of that window frame out all the way around needs to be 3 1/4 inch, so that I have a good reveal in between my interior casing pieces and my exterior casing pieces, which you will see shortly. Now the sill piece, this is super important. It basically centers, it's the foundation of everything. And the 2 different lines that I made were, the first mark that you see me making here is for the inside of the windowsill, and then the second mark that you're going to see there on the left of the board is from the inside edge into the very first edge of the internal window casing. Did that make sense? No? Don't worry. Hang on, and it will once you see the install. I basically used math and science and alchemy to give me the perfect measurements that I needed to make sure that the overlap was correct for the windowsill, and that I gave myself enough room to make the sill extension, the piece that extended beyond the vertical casing piece, to look aesthetic. Just again, hang on, it's going to make more sense. To square up the internal casing, I used a 12-inch speed square and then slid in my casing. I went back and forth with myself a few different times on what I was going to do exactly about the bead board that butted up to this casing. And the reason why is because the bead board is, I think it's 11/16 of an inch thick. And what that comes out to affect is the look of the finished casing piece. I feel like I've said casing a million times at this point. Just hang on with me. If you're playing a drinking game where I say casing, you are going to die by the end of this video because I will say it 1 million more times. But bear with me. Now, when it comes to installing the casing, are you dead yet? When it comes to installing the casing, I did want to make sure that the windowsill itself was flush up against the drywall. This would allow for the reveal that you'll see on the top of the drywall, so the top that is above the beadboard, to be flush with the drywall. If I would have just installed the casing directly onto the beadboard, it would look great and flush directly on the beadboard, but then you would have this weird 11/16 of an inch gap between the vertical and the horizontal pieces and the drywall, and I just really didn't want to do that. I thought that that would look dumb, and frankly, it was a little bit more challenging and enjoyable to cut out 2 little notches on either side of the windowsill, to slide everything in perfectly there, and then just tack it all in place. After I did that, I measured from the inside edge of that internal casing piece 3.5 inches, and then cut out with a multi-tool on either side that 3.5 inch piece. Again, I'm doing that because I'm going to use this 1x4, aka 3.5 inches wide, as vertical pieces to finish out this window molding. Now, what I would suggest that you do is whenever you install these, cut 2 perfectly mitered ends so that those ends are perfectly square up and down so that they can directly touch that windowsill and the finish out will look really nice. Then to finish off the window trim, we are going to take appropriate measurements to do the top piece, which we'll call the entablature, and the bottom piece. I don't know what you call the bottom piece. I wish I had a fancy word to give you. I'm just going to call it the piece under the windowsill. But take those measurements. Again, even though you're going to try to pick boards that are as straight as possible, there can still be a little bit of deviation between the top and the bottom. So once you get your measurements for that top piece, we're going to go ahead and do this. Now, the top piece for me is 29 and 5/16 inch wide. That piece is going to be a 1x6 piece of select pine. Now, for the very top piece, we're going to use a 1x2 and flip it on its side, but I want to add a whole inch of measurement to 29 and 5/16 so I can have a 1/2 inch reveal on the left side and a 1/2 inch reveal on the right side. Then for the bottom piece, take another 1x2, but then rip it down to be a 1/2 inch thick and 1 inch wide. And then the dimensions of this are, we're going to add a whole inch to 29 and 5/16 so we can have 1/4 inch of a reveal on the left and the right side of that entablature. Did that make sense? No? Good, because I'm never going to explain it again and you're going to be lost. I'm just kidding. Just watch the rest of the video. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm doing here. Now for that very bottom piece, start from the bottom. So the bottom piece, I'm taking a 1x2, using one of my 1/2 inch setup blocks and cutting that 1x2 to be 1/2 inch thick. These setup blocks that I have, I'm pretty sure they're $30 on Amazon. They work great and are really perfect for my little setup here. Then using another setup block, I went ahead and marked up just 1 inch thick and ran the rest of that 1x2 that I'd already cut down, so it'd be 1 inch thick. Now, pre-marking everything really helps me when I do these type of entablatures above doorways or windows or what have you. I'm going to mark the bottom piece to be 1/4 of an inch in, and then the top piece to be 1/2 of an inch in, so I can just line up that middle 1x6 to be perfectly in the edge or in the center between those 2 lines, and then just tack it on there with some brad nails. You don't need to use glue. I use glue on the bottom piece, and then I decided to heck with it. Let's just use brad nails on that very top 1x2 piece. After I assemble that whole casement piece together for the very top of the header, I then cut down that bottom 1x4, and then using a multi-tool and just rinsing and repeating, I went ahead and cut out that little section of the beadboard, making sure everything was nice and square with that chisel, and then used a mallet to pound in that bottom 1x4 piece before securing it with some 16 gauge brad nails. And I advise using these 16 gauge brad nails because it's just going to hold everything in there a little bit more tightly than the 18 gauge would, especially if you have this thicker piece of, well, wood like you do here for the bottom or the top piece. If you have something that's a little bit thinner, 18 gauge is perfectly fine, but to each their own. Now, before I reveal the finished product for the brick, I will point out that I did have one of my friends come out and help me brick the outside of the home. And this was a huge clutch decision. I knew that he was an expert. I've never done a brick wall like this, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't look the way I wanted it to. I will say I am super satisfied with the way it looked. One thing I was kind of surprised by whenever I was editing this video is the camera actually picks up a lot of color discrepancy that I cannot see in person. Now, granted, depending on where you're standing, on what side of the house, what time of day, you can see a little bit of the mismatch because, again, this is never going to match perfectly. These bricks were selected 2 totally different years apart, but we did try to blend it as best as possible. And another thing that would help me to make the brick blend a little bit better is to do an acid wash. It will wash off some of that exterior sheen of the mortar that got on the brick and help it just to pop a little bit, blend in a little bit more, and look a lot better. But frankly, again, I'm really satisfied with the way this turned out. I even installed that little soffit piece right above the window and painted it with our paint trim color on the outside so that everything matched. But now for the inside, I'm super happy here. It's weird to say this, but the bathroom actually feels like cozy, like a place that you want to stay. One of the things we did, we added these little sticky inserts on the window to make the glass look like it's reeded glass. Really, really nice. I didn't show any video of me prepping or painting or sanding. If you want a video like that, let me know. But I will say another thing that doesn't come across on camera is the feeling of the wood. This whole thing, all this trim is solid wood that's been painted over, but the aesthetic feeling that I get from it, it's totally different than rooms where I have MDF trim throughout my house. So I would recommend if you do something like this, if you can, pay a little bit extra and get that pine to put in your home. I hope you stick around for our next video. Like, subscribe, and I hope to see you here next time.